in the third week of a series that we started called Know Thyself. And what we're trying to attempting to do is really answer one of the biggest questions that people are asking in their lives today. One of the most complicated questions that people are asking. There's one question that I think is more difficult to answer today than it was before. And that's the heart behind this series is, can we answer this question? And here it is. Really, this is it. And it sounds really simple when you hear it, but it's actually way more complicated when you think about it. The question is, who are you? Who are you? That's a really simple thing to say, but when you start really thinking about what it means, who are you? That is one of the most important questions that we can answer, and it's incredibly complicated. And here's why it's important. It's important because everything else in our life flows out of how we answer that question. How we answer the question of who are you impacts everything else that we do. The way we spend our time and our energy, the way that we use our lives, the way that we spend our money, the way that we think about ourselves, the way that we approach other people. All of those things are largely defined by the answer to this one question, who are you? What is your identity? How do you understand yourself to be? And by the way, let me just say, this is not exclusive to people of faith. And so if you're a person who is exploring faith, you have questions about Christianity, this is not a conversation that's just for people of faith. This is actually a human question. This is true of everybody. If you're a human being, how you answer the question of who you are, how you resolve the question of identity will determine everything else that you do. Everything else flows out of that. In fact, we can actually see where everything that we're doing connects back to that. When we look at the striving in our lives, the things that we're working for, the effort that we put forth, whether it's for recognition from other people or approval of other people, whether it's some sort of degree, some sort of accomplishment, whether it's some sort of work achievement, whether it's possessions, whether it's some sort of experience, whether it's relationships, oftentimes when you start peeling back the layers of all of those different things, what you discover is there is this deep desire for identity, and we're trying to capture that through all of those things. In fact, it's not just those things that we do, it's even the way that we think. So every religious system, every philosophy, every ideology in the world is ultimately, every one of those ever is trying to answer the question of identity. So if you think about it this way for just a moment, this is why this is the case. Think about this. Every one of those, religion, philosophy, ideology, basically is trying to answer the question of what is going on with the world? Why is the world here? And then what do we do in it? And so those things, when you answer that, when you see, well, this is what the world's all about, this is why people are here, the next logical conclusion is, well, then I guess that defines who I am. And so there is this constant quest, and there has been through all of history, for human beings to know, like, who am I? Who am I? What am I really all about? And so if you are human, at some point, as difficult as it is, you have to wrestle with this question at a deep level. I know that makes some of us uncomfortable. I know some of you already are like, I really don't like this series. I'm sorry, it's like just a few more weeks long. But it makes us uncomfortable when we wrestle with it. However, it's incredibly important that we do. Especially in this postmodern context that we find ourselves in. This is a really complicated place when it comes to identity. There's never been a culture where we could shape and craft and manipulate what we would refer to as identity like the one we live in today, right? I mean, today you can distort, you can create an understanding, right? You can project, you can craft, you can even have multiple sorts of identities through social media, through all these different means. And so it really is a complicated place. There's complicated things speaking into this. But here's the question. In our culture today, when we talk about crafting our identity, we talk about those kinds of things, are we describing identity or are we describing image? And the answer is the latter. We're actually describing image. We're not actually talking about identity. In fact, image is not identity. And I think that's a really important thing for us to understand. Image is what we project to other people. Image is how we want other people to perceive us. It is the attempt that we make to show others what we want to show them about who we are. And here's what's fascinating about our culture today. We spend billions of dollars and countless hours on our image, and we spend very little time thinking about or talking about identity. Isn't that true? I mean, look at our culture today. We're all so concerned. We're so worried. We're so much thinking and spending around our image, and very seldom are we actually thinking about our identity. And yet at the same time, this same culture that is so image conscious is experiencing this sort of existential crisis beneath the surface of image. We're having this growing angst around not really knowing who we are. Because if we don't know who we are, it means we're not really living. We're not really living life. We're actually going through the motions of living life, but we're not actually living life. And so there's this angst that rises up inside of us. Do we know who we are? Maybe you've heard somebody say this about another person. Well, once you get to know them, and then they fill in the blank. You ever heard somebody say that about someone else? You ever heard someone say that about you? You always hope it's good, right? Like, well, Brad's kind of a jerk, but once you get to know him, there's another layer to him. In fact, one of my good friends, Ryan, a few years ago, we actually met about 6 or 7 years ago. I forgot the first time we met. We were hanging out, we became friends about a year into it. I'm like, man, why haven't we been friends longer? And he said, well, actually, I met you before you think we did. And I was like, what do you mean? He goes, yeah, the first time I met you, I thought you were a jerk. Like, I didn't like you. And I was like, oh, that's good. And he goes, no, really, I didn't like you. Why? Why didn't you? I wanted to know this, right? But then he got to know me, right? So what is he saying? What are we saying when we say this? Well, what we're saying is there is an image, but beneath the surface, there is something else that is more about identity, right? There's something even different. So we come up with these phrases like, looks can be deceiving. Don't judge a book by its cover, right? We say these sorts of things like things may not be as they seem. We use this to say, well, there's one thing on the surface, but there's another thing beneath that surface. So we have image. But what we also seem to be indicating is that there's this other thing that I would call reputation. It's who you really are. Let me distinguish between these two. So image, it's who you project yourself to be. But reputation is developed by how you live. You see the difference there? So image, it's what I project, but reputation, that is determined by how I live. So it's something that is gained over time. I behave a particular way. I move in a particular direction over and over and over again. And pretty soon people go, oh, that's who you really are. It's something that you now project despite your image. It's an understanding that people have about you. So you can never walk by a mirror and check out your reputation. Right? How's my reputation look today? Well, let me just clean it up real quick. You can't do that. You can't get on social media and manipulate your reputation. You can manipulate your image, but your reputation is gained by how you live, which means your reputation is deeply tied to your identity. If you have a strong sense of identity, you will have a reputation that is congruent with who you are, right? What people see in you, what people experience in you, the way people interact with you will be consistent with who you are at your core. So if they're having a good experience with you, that means there's something about your identity that maybe you would embrace and like. And so the question is, do you have this durable core? Do you have this deep sense of meaning? Do you have an identity that is strong enough and good enough that now the experience that people are having, your reputation, actually reflects who you really are? So we have sayings for this too, by the way. We say things like, what you see is what you get, right? Or you meet somebody and you say, that person is really authentic. Or have you ever heard somebody describe another person as transparent? They're really transparent. You know what I love about those words? We all wish we were described that way. I've never met anybody that's like, I hope people know me as sort of shallow and artificial. I just kind of like to have this hard candy shell that barely no one knows that there's a soft, gooey inside. Like, that never gets said, right? When I say transparent and authentic, that what you see is what you get. There's this weird thing in all of us. I know it's true for me. I know it's in a few people that I talk to about this. It's true. All of us, we hear that and we go, man, that's exactly how I want to be known. I want my reputation. I want how I actually live to be consistent with who I am. We want our identity to be that strong. And so the question is, who are you? Can we move beyond being image conscious to being identity conscious? Who are you? Now, as is often the case and not always helpful, I try to answer questions with other questions. So who are you really gets to this other question, and that's, well, who gets to say who you are? That really is where we begin to understand how this gets resolved. Who are you? Well, who gets to say who you are? Is it the surrounding society that tells you who you are? Do we let the values or the norms or the behaviors of society to define your identity? Is that where you find identity? Or is it our specific, maybe regional culture? Like, for example, living in the Northwest doesn't mean we just all love flannels and beards. It's actually shaping values. It teaches us things about who we are, right? And so do we let culture, our immediate culture, shape us? Do we let our family of origin shape us? We grew up in homes where there are behaviors and there's DNA and there's patterns and there's all these things that have been going on, and parents who tell you, you should grow up to do this. And so do we let that shape who we are? Or do we just choose to do it ourselves? Like, I'm the one that's in charge. Here's what's interesting. All of those influences, they try to tell you, this is a very complicated thing. When I say that, every one of those things are trying to tell you who you are. Society, culture, your family. I mean, anybody that ever had parents, your parents tried to tell you to be somebody, right? And you, even if you land on you, the question is this: where will you find the answer? If we conclude, okay, you doing identity formation is about you, like you are the one that's going to answer this, where are you going to look? Society, culture, family of origin, right? So once you start answering this question, you say, okay, well, who's going to define my identity? How do I know who I am? What you begin to realize is that you need answers to that question. You need somebody speaking to this that is anchored outside of our society, something that is anchored outside of our culture, something that is anchored outside of our own personal experience or our family of origin. The only way that we are going to navigate a life with all of its ups and downs and all the different scenarios, environments that we find ourselves in, is if we have an identity that is anchored in something outside of those things. Which brings us to the heart of this series. There are these words, there are these descriptors, these monikers that are being given to the early people that were in the Jesus movement. These descriptions that described who they were. They said, this is your identity. And it was different than culture. And it was different than their family of origin. It was different than even what they dreamt about themselves. And so our heart behind this series is to look at these titles and descriptions and then to begin to let them transform us. If this is how God describes us, what does that mean? What does it mean about the way that I live? What does it mean about the world that I live in? If these are the titles that define my identity, what are the implications? And so last week, we looked at the word disciple. And if you were here last week, we really unpacked the idea of Jesus being a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi, and what that meant. And if you weren't here, I encourage you to go listen to that. But today we come to a peculiar phrase that we actually see for the first time in Acts chapter 9. Here's what's also interesting about this. This is the first phrase that was used that we have describing people who joined the Jesus movement outside of the word disciple. This is the first word that's used to describe them from an external source. So long before they were called Christians, this is the phrase that was used. And I just want to give you some background to what we're going to read. When the church first began, it started as a really a sect of Judaism. That's how Christianity really began. And it began in the city of Jerusalem. And there's this iconic day in church history called Pentecost, when after the Holy Spirit moved in a very dynamic way, the Apostle Peter preached, thousands of people become Jesus followers, and then from there it just starts to multiply. It starts to spill out and burst over the seams of Jerusalem and into the surrounding region. And it is this brand new revolutionary movement. Well, obviously the powers that be in the existing establishment didn't appreciate this liberation that was happening, and so there was resistance that came against the early church. That resistance was spearheaded by primarily one individual who historically we identify with the persecution of the early church. That individual is a guy named Saul. And in Acts chapter 9, we've just been introduced to him in Acts chapter 8 at the stoning of Stephen, one of the disciples. And then in Acts chapter 9, we read this in verse 1 about him, and we find this descriptor, this moniker given to the early Christians. It says this: "But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord," that's the word we looked at last week, "Saul went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem." So he writes a letter. He says, I want a letter that gives me permission to go to Damascus, and if I find anybody participating in this sect called the Way, men or women in this sect, this followers of the Way, I want to bind them and bring them back. Followers of the Way. In fact, that phrase, it's not just used here. It's also used in Acts chapter 19. It's used in Acts chapter 24. And we have these people being referenced. Their identity their identity, not their image, their identity is that they are followers of the way. Now, this is a loaded term, this whole concept of follower of the way. And so I want to just focus first of all on the word way. The word way, if you look it up in the dictionary, it is primarily, first of all, what you'll see is it's a noun. A noun. The word way typically is a reference to a road. It's a reference to a pathway. It's a reference to some way in which you move from one point to another. So if you're thinking about going to Ritzville for some reason, which I don't know why you would, but if you were, I-90 is the way in which you would choose to go there, right? That's the path that you would take. And the way that you make a way is by chopping down trees or pulling out stumps or moving rocks and then paving and creating a pathway, a direction that says, now I can get from here to there in an efficient pattern, efficient way. And you'll put signs up and say, here are the rules and here's the things you need to do so that you can actually go from point A to point B. That's the way that we understand the word way. It seems to be about getting somewhere. But when we hear those in the Jesus movement called followers of the way, is that what we're talking about? Are we describing destination? Is that what this is about? Here's what's interesting. When you start to really dive into what's being described, it seems that the word way is referring to the means by which we get there as much as it has to do anything with the destination. Let me explain it this way. The way, like which way will you go, doesn't just describe the path that you will take. The means by which you will take that path is also included in the way, is it not? So will you go by bike? Will you ride there? Will you drive there in a car? Will you walk there on your feet? That is the way. What's the way you're going to get there? Oh, I'm going to drive. So the way isn't just a noun, right? The way is also describing the manner in which. Will you go there by the scenic byway or will you take the freeway? By the way, they both end in the same place, but the journey is different depending on which you choose. The way. The word way seems to be as much about how we do things as it is where we are going. So let me give you an example. Some of you have been to the discipleship course, Be With Jesus, and so you've heard me say this before, but growing up around my grandpa was one of those guys, like that iconic kind of American guy who worked with his hands, you know. In fact, I've got old black and white pictures in my office of him. He was a hardworking guy. And my grandpa and his generation in general, you would hear them say things like, well, that's just the American way. Well, what did he mean when he said that? Well, he wasn't describing a path that you go on, right? If something is done the American way, he's saying, well, let's imagine there are two things that could be done. One thing produces this product, the other thing produces the same product. But the American way says, we're going to produce the same product, but the manner in which we do it is going to be distinct and different. It's somehow American, which now I just think meant greasier and dirtier and sawdust and like iron and steel and stuff like that. It's the American way, right? We're going to do it the American way. It had something to do with the process that was involved, right? There was a way that things were done, and that was the American way. So it's describing not the end product, but the process in actually getting there. So this phrase, followers of the way, seems to be speaking about the process that these people were living. Are you with me? So where does this come from? Why does this phrase, how does it get used? This is a really good thing for us to think about. And actually, this is really good. I want you to just check this out. In Luke chapter 3, we come to Luke's biography of Jesus called the Gospel of Luke. Luke's biography of Jesus begins in this moment describing something before the moment that Jesus started his public ministry. And it introduces us to a guy named John the Baptist. And in Luke chapter 3, verse 3, we read about John the Baptist, and there's something that's being stated that opens our eyes to what's going on here. Verse 3, it says, and he, speaking of John the Baptist, went into the region around the Jordan, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And then Luke adds this thing. He says, as it is written. So in the way, he went and does this. He goes and does this. He preaches about the forgiveness of sins in the way that is, as it is written in the words of Isaiah the prophet. And so Luke is saying that whatever John the Baptist is doing is connected to what Isaiah the prophet was talking about. And then he says this, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Every valley shall be filled, every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall become straight, and the rough places shall become level ways, and all flesh shall see the salvation of God. Make way for the Lord. Prepare the way. So we have this quote from hundreds of years before Jesus that's being referenced to the moment that Jesus is now coming onto the scene. What is this really all about? Well, let me explain. So back when Isaiah first wrote this, hundreds of years before, the people of Israel, they find themselves in Babylonian captivity. They're in captivity. They're enslaved. There is another nation dominating them. They aren't free. They aren't liberated. They aren't living the life that they were created to live. They are in bondage. And so they're living in this for a long period of time. And while they're living here, rather than grow hopeless, they look to their past. And when they looked at their past, they realized this isn't the first time we've been enslaved. This is not the first time we've been held captive and been in bondage. So they look back and they see that way back in their history, there was this other place in Egypt where they were also in captivity, where they were also experiencing a slavery. And in this moment, there was this leader that rises up, a guy named Moses, and he leads them out of captivity, takes them through the wilderness to a place called the Promised Land. And we call this the Exodus. And so what Isaiah is doing in this moment in the future of that, but before Jesus, is he's saying, yes, we're in captivity, but now he's looking to the future, and he's not writing about what's happening now, but he's saying there will be a moment when there will be another Exodus, when there'll be another individual who rises up, and another person who liberates us from our bondage and our slavery, who takes us out of our wilderness that we're wandering in. And then when Luke sees John the Baptist in the wilderness proclaiming the way of the Lord, Luke says, this is the moment that Isaiah was talking about. This is the moment when we will be liberated from our bondage and from our slavery, from our wilderness. We will find a way out of this. Now, what most of the disciples didn't realize is that this Exodus was going to be very different than the first Exodus. The first Exodus was very physical, which explains why the first disciples thought that Jesus was liberating them in some sort of physical kingdom sort of way. But all of this makes so much more sense when we listen to things that Jesus said. For example, Jesus arrives on the scene, and then in John chapter 14, verse 6, he says, I am what? The way. John was preparing the way, and Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Nobody sees the Father. Nobody encounters their Creator unless it's through the work that I am doing. I am the way. I am the way. So instead of there being some physical person leading us out of some physical place, Jesus is saying, no, there's a different kind of Exodus that you're going to experience, and it's in me. I am not covered in asphalt. I am covered in skin, and you're going to see in me a way out of your slavery, a way out of your bondage. So what Jesus is talking about is not some line on a map that gets us from point A to point B. He's talking about the process of getting there. There is an exodus. He looks at us in our lives and says, yes, there's bondage, and yeah, there's slavery, and yeah, there's wilderness, and yeah, there's frustration, but there's a way out of this life that you're living. There is a new way. There's an exodus. By the way, this explains other things other people have written in history, like Thomas A. Kempis, wrote The Imitation of Christ, and he said this. He said, if we wish to be truly enlightened and free from all blindness of heart, let our chief effort therefore be to study the life of Jesus Christ. Notice what he says. If you want to be enlightened, if you want to see things like you've never seen them before, if you want to have the blindness of your heart removed, look at Jesus, because he's the way. So Jesus doesn't look at us and say, like, we find Jesus, we believe certain things about him, and he reveals himself, and we meet him, and he goes, okay, here's the deal. There's a secret path that gets you where you want to go. I'm going to stay here. But if you go down around the block, behind a couple of buildings, there's this one little path. I want you to get on it and just follow the directions from there. Jesus doesn't do that. We find Jesus, and he goes, okay, now, I am the way. I am the means. The path is me. So yeah, Jesus walked the roads between Galilee and Jerusalem, but it's not where he walked that mattered. It is how he walked. It's the way that he acted, the way that he felt, the way that he gestured, the way that he loved people, the way that he healed people, the way that he served people, the way that he washed people's feet, the way that he died for his friends. That's what matters. And I sort of wonder that if in all of the reductionism of our age, all of us trying to get to the right answer that we can mark on a test somewhere, we have reduced Jesus to a means to an end rather than realizing that he is the end in himself. He is the way. And so he offers a new perspective. He says, no, when you start moving through life the way that I move through life, you start to see the world differently. You start to see others differently. You start to interact with them differently. You start to see yourself differently. I started backpacking when I was in high school. I kind of got the bug. Anybody else like to backpack? Anybody else? A few of us, yeah, like to put stuff on our back and carry it into the woods and get dirty. That's what it is. But I got the bug, and I lived in Arizona at the time. And then in the early 2000s, we moved to Spokane, and I was just so excited to backpack in the Northwest. I had no idea where to go. I was like, all right, new place, new state, no idea where to get started. The good news was I had some friends, some guys that had been backpacking the Northwest that I met right away that were from here and they planned trips every year. And so they invited me to join them, which was really great, except one thing. They were older, and yes, they were wiser, but they were also slow. And so the first time I went with them, I didn't know what to expect, because for me, it's like, we're going to go backpacking, we're going to cover some ground, right? And so they planned this trip, and I packed my gear, and I get the list and do all the stuff and join them, and we drive in the car, and we go to the trailhead, and the first thing I learned was pictures, lots and lots of pictures. We're not going to get out and hike. We're going to have a photo shoot of what we all looked like when we were clean. That's basically what that is, right? So we're taking all these pictures, now my camera, now my camera, and we're all just, standing there with our... just looking like, there's the trail, here we go. So then we finish that, and they're kind of dilly down. We turn around, start walking, and I'm not kidding. The first time I hiked with them, the pace was so slow, I actually thought they were messing with me. I had to work at walking slow. I was like, just slow down. I'm having to make effort to walk slow. And so we did that first hike. Second hike I did with them, they started to pick up on the fact that, okay, he's competitive. I'll admit it, I'm competitive. And the path is about getting to the top. That's the reason we're here, right? To get to where we're going. And so eventually they would look at me and they would say, okay, Bradley, just go on ahead. We'll see you in a little while, And so I would get ahead of them and I would just take off and I would be going. And I would beat them to camp by an hour, right? And I get to camp and I'd set up the stuff. And here's what I noticed. When they got there, they were just as happy, if not more happy than I was, right? And we're all in the same place. We're all doing the same thing, except they're just kind of smiling. I don't know, slow pokes, These days I'm older. And I'm wiser. And I am slow. And I've got 3 girls and a son-in-law that like to backpack. So now when we go backpacking, I find myself wanting to take pictures at the trailhead. And then when we walk on the trail, I've realized that we're all going to get there eventually. And so I find myself just breathing in the mountain air and tasting the freshness. I find myself picking huckleberries off the bushes now and collecting them as I go and taking way too long than I should. And I find myself looking out over every vista and just absorbing it and taking it in. I find myself, if there's a creek or something going by, I just listen to the sound and oftentimes just reach my hands into it, take my pack off. I move slower because I've realized the path isn't about getting to the destination. It's about the journey. It's about what we experience in the middle. Jesus is inviting us into a way that is different. He invites us to re-identify the way we're doing things. Yeah, we're going to go to work. Yeah, we're going to go to school. Yeah, we're going to be a neighbor. Yeah, we're going to do all the things that we do. But he's saying there is a different way. In fact, at another point in his ministry, he says there's a road that's wide and everybody seems to be going down it. Everybody's going this way, but there's another way to live in this life. There is a construct that people are operating with. And by the way, a lot of people just seem to approach Jesus and they believe certain things about him, but they never actually let that influence the way that they're living. The how of the journey doesn't change. These early members of this Jesus movement, they embraced this way so powerfully that it became their reputation. The way they lived, they were known as the followers of the way. I love this quote from this historian. By the way, I love it when historians write about Christianity. It's always fascinating. But I love this particular quote. Diana Butler Bass says, "For all the complexity of primitive Christianity, a startling idea runs through early records of faith. Christianity seems to have succeeded because it transformed the lives of people in a chaotic world." I love that historical perspective. It's almost laughable, right? Like, in other words, she says, it worked, right? Like, life was really messy, but when these people started living this way, it actually transformed their lives, and they made a difference in the world. The Jesus way makes a difference, which means this, and I think this is so liberating. Your identity as a follower of the way is your permission to live like Jesus. So all the other stuff you think you're living for, all the striving for approval, all the wanting of some sort of recognition or status, all the other things that drive us, all the things that push us into places of insecurity, all of those things get eradicated. And there is this moment where when Jesus says you are a follower of the way, it is permission for you to move through life in a distinctive way that is marked by the life of Jesus. Not modified behavior to somehow appease an angry God, but a liberated life that is living in love towards the people around you. In fact, let me just show you this. There's this moment where Jesus is with his disciples. It's one of the final moments before he goes to the cross, and he's instructing them about, hey, like, what are you guys going to go do? And I just think it's beautiful that this is what he says. John chapter 13, verse 34, he says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another." That was a new idea. That you love one another. "Just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another." And then he says this, I love this, "By this, all will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." The early Christians didn't have to tell people who they followed or what they believed because their reputation preceded them. They weren't called followers of the way because they were extra religious and pious and jumped through a bunch of religious hoops. They were called followers of the way because they were radically for others, and they were compassionate, and they were kind, and they were forgiving, and they were loving, and they were joy-filled. That's who they were because they followed the way. One last thing. This morning I woke up really early, and I didn't like my message. And so when a pastor has to speak a message 5 times, that's a very anxious moment. And so early this morning, I just started obsessing about logical incongruencies and things that were here. And I'm moving stuff around. About 6:30, I was hitting the panic button, but there is no easy button in sermon writing. And so I had thrown away more material than I had left. And I was just like, this is not good. And so the pressure just started to build. By 7:05, I was a stress ball. You can ask my wife and daughter. I don't know that I was that pleasant to be with for the 5 minutes they saw me this morning. And I got in the car and I was kind of angry driving to our first service. And then I just hit me I'm halfway to our first service. And I thought, I'm talking about how we do things and the way in which we move. And I am literally living the exact opposite in my internal life right now. And so I'm halfway to our first service this morning and I just went, why? Do I care what people think? Am I not going to love people the way that Jesus loves them? What is it? What is it that's stirring this inside of me? And there in my car, I just took a moment to say, I think I'm going to be a follower of the way today and not just follow the pattern of stress and anxiety and all expectations that everybody else seems to follow. Now, my message may not be that good, but I hope at the end of the day, my reputation matches my identity. Amen? Would you stand with me? May you discover that the way of Jesus has far more to do with how we get there than we ever imagined. May you discover his love, his compassion, his grace. May you slow down. May you smell the air. May you see the world the way that he sees it. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. If you guys want to pray with somebody, there's always folks down front to pray with, and we will see you guys next Sunday as we continue on. See you later.